Resident Evil seems as if it has been around since time began. It has been one of the biggest selling gaming franchises of all time, spawning movies, collectibles, clothes and cosplay. It has resonated with millions of people since its inception in 1996. It was directed by Shinji Mikami, Resident Evil 1+4, Dino Crisis and The Evil Within, and initially conceived by Takuro Fujiwara. I, for one, have been a huge fan along with the millions of others since 1996. I have enjoyed all of the games that have been created, but more than that I am really intrigued by the lore that has been created by each iteration. The story has grown arms and legs and now spans a fair number of years. The vast history of where the T-Virus originated has been put out there for everyone to see. It is a great story and as such makes the fans like me wanting more and more. There are many games and probably more than you realized unless you followed the series closely. The Resident Evil series has had its ups and downs, but I would like to talk about my experience with some UPS, and fortuitously this corresponds with the first 3 iterations of the franchise. Resident Evil releasing in 1996 was a trendsetter. It was unlike any other game that I, or any other had played in my opinion. You are now entering the world of survival horror were the words uttered whenever you started up a new game. Those words would be synonymous with the series for at least the first 3 games. Resident Evil was the first survival horror I ever played, or at least that's what my memory tells me. I don't remember any other title being so unique upon launch. The game had the feel of a claustrophobic horror movie. This was unlike any other experience from a gaming perspective. Sure, I played some creepy games, but nothing like this. Part of the draw other than the great graphics and setting was the story. There was intrigue from the outset. I wanted to know what was going on in this mysterious mansion. Why were there monsters who appeared to soak up bullets, and why would I nearly become a Jill sandwich? These questions and more drove me through this game until its inevitable finish. A modern masterpiece in gaming and a true classic in my mind. Resident Evil 2 was up next, and I can remember picking up Resident Evil Director's Cut from my local game store. With this version of the game, came a Resident Evil 2 demo disc. The original game with a few tweaks was more than enough to warrant the purchase, but the fact it had the demo of the next iteration, well, freaking out was an understatement at this point. The demo hit all the right notes and set up the sequel perfectly. I can vividly remember now running towards my mother's car to be driven to our local Dixon's to purchase the game upon launch. No pre-orders back then, first come, first served was the order of the day. I remember paying £49.99, which took me a considerable amount of time to save, by the way, which in those days was a lot of cash. By today's standard it is worth almost £90, not a cheap purchase by any stretch of the imagination, and a luxury that as a 16-year-old I was very grateful for. In the lead up to launch I had read everything and anything I could get my hands on in regards to the game. I knew the price, I knew it came with 2 discs, both pertaining to different characters and both discs having 2 separate ways to go through the game. That meant 4 playthroughs. £49.99 was seeming like a bargain. It, of course, ended up turning out that way. The game was terrific and is still, to this day, my favorite Resident Evil experience. I played the game for months on end. I made sure I saw every ending, collected every bonus or reward, and generally put my life on hold in every other aspect. Leon and Claire were now my new heroes. Previously it was Jill and Chris, with Barry Burton thrown in for good comic measure, but Leon and Claire were now where Resident Evil was at for me. The fact that Claire and Leon were the stars of the show, see what I did there, meant that I was expecting more of the same from Resident Evil 3, Nemesis. I didn't actually have to wait long too, as it released the very next year in 1999. To my shock, Claire and Leon were nowhere to be seen, and Jill Valentine was back as the sole character for this game. To say I was disappointed upon hearing this was an understatement of the greatest magnitude. I was pissed off, to be completely honest. Why, after releasing such a magnificent opus such as Resident Evil 2 with 2 discs, 2 playable characters and 4 playthroughs, would you go back to a game which had less choice than the very first game? Needless to say, my disappointment and rage did not last that long, as I was in many aspects glad to see Jill Valentine again. It was during the lead up to launch of this game that I also learned that this game took place at the same time as Resident Evil 2. This was Capcom's first venture into creating lore in my opinion. Why continue the story when you can increase the world of survival horror backdrop? The game itself deviated from its original genre slightly and was a lot more action-oriented, especially with the Nemesis hunting you for the majority of the game. Resident Evil 3, Nemesis gained excellent reviews and reception from almost everyone, and I was no exception. It fed my Resident Evil craving without improving upon Part 2 or even Part 1 if I'm being truly honest. Sure, the graphics were better, but the story is always something I judge games on, and this felt like a side story to me. This was bore out from many rumors that Jill Valentine was not actually supposed to be the main protagonist and another new character had been planned to take over this game. I'd imagine that introducing a new character at this stage would have been detrimental to the franchise, as that's what it was becoming, and as such I can see why sticking with Jill was a sensible decision. February 2000, approximately 1 year after Resident Evil 3 was released, Resident Evil: Code Veronica was released for the Sega Dreamcast. As I did not have a Dreamcast at that point in my life, it would be a while before I sampled its delights. Delight it was, and it continued the Resident Evil story, this time going back to Claire Redfield from Resident Evil 2 and her brother from the first game. Again, this spelled out that Capcom were not interested in just making sequels, they wanted to build lore, they wanted to explore more of the landscape and kept things concurrent. Resident Evil: Code Veronica took place 3 months after Resident Evil 2 and approximately at the same time as Resident Evil 3, Nemesis. Capcom had their work cut out from now on in my opinion. When you make a series of games all based in the same world, it makes sense to keep things canon. If you don't, then you run the risk of losing your fans. They did a great job with Code Veronica, and it definitely has its place in the Resident Evil franchise. It was also a coup of Sega to get this title exclusively, at least for a while, as Sega were suffering at the hands of Sony and the PlayStation. Between 1999, 2002, Capcom released Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil Zero exclusively for the Nintendo GameCube. I have recently played both games on the PS4 and can say that, like Code Veronica, they have their place in Resident Evil history as very enjoyable games. In particular, Resident Evil: The Remake was a joy, and GameCube owners at the time really were a lucky bunch, as it was a very worthwhile gaming experience and definitely different to the original in enough ways that made it scary, eerie, claustrophobic, and a great gaming experience all in one package. Things were about to change in the gaming industry. It was 2005, Shinji Mikami ditched his producing duties and got back on the Resident Evil train as director. Resident Evil 4 was released across a number of platforms and to fantastic reviews. Resident Evil 5 was next, releasing 4 years after Resident Evil 4, dev time increasing hugely now, was another very similar foray into the zombie-infested world. Focusing very much on action and introducing a new character, Shiva, it gained very positive reviews but solidified the series' movement away from survival horror. I personally enjoyed this game a lot and completed multiple playthroughs. 2012 was the next iteration of the franchise. Resident Evil 6 dropped on numerous platforms on October 2012. This, in my opinion, is the weakest of the numbered games coming from the franchise. Splitting the story into 3 parts. Leon's missions were more survival horror based, at least at the beginning. Chris's story was more action based, and again new character entry Jake Muller enjoyed a story that tried to incorporate both survival horror and action. This title was Capcom's poorest reviewed game for a while and spelled out the need to reinvent the universe. The lore and story were not the problem. The fact that Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 were very similar games meant like 1, 2, 3, things were becoming stale. Part 7 released in January 2017, 5 years after Part 6. Capcom did their homework and utilized Sony's newest toy, the PSVR, to mesmerizing effect. In terms of the future, I am very hopeful that the story and lore continue. I would imagine that we will see Ethan Winters again in a few years, and this is something I definitely look forward to. I hope you have enjoyed my thoughts on the Resident Evil franchise, both the past, the present, and now future. I'd say we got a little further down the rabbit hole on this one. Remember, nothing is true, everything is permitted here at Phantom Lord Gaming. Peace and love. Phantom Lord.